Uju nijiwag, miigwech bizindawiag nungum. Hello, my friends. Thank you for listening to me today. I'm Dr. Katrina Phillips, and I'm an assistant professor of history at Macalester College. I want to thank all of you for joining us today, and I also want to thank everybody at the Minnesota Historical Society for helping make this series a reality. And before we begin, I want to acknowledge that even though this is a virtual event, the Minnesota History Center is located on the traditional territory of many nations and on the homeland of the ancestral lands of Dakota people, who still continue to call this region home. Minnesota is centered within Dakota creation stories and is an important place in traditional Ojibwe history and the history of other Native nations. We pay our respects to the Indigenous ancestors of this place. This is the third event in an ongoing series called Shared Spaces and Public Places, which is a free 4-part discussion series offered and archived on the MNHS Facebook and YouTube pages once each month, July through October. And as a moderator for this series, I'll be joined each month by scholars, artists, and community members for a discussion about local as well as national issues. And I am so excited today to have Dr. Jean O'Brien and Hannah Maruyama with me today. Dr. Jean O'Brien is White Earth Ojibwe, and she is a distinguished McKnight University professor and Northrop professor at the University of Minnesota. She's a co-founder and past president of the Native American and Indigenous Studies Association and has written several books, including co-authoring a recent book entitled Monumental Mobility, The Memory Work of Massasoit. And Hannah Maruyama is a PhD candidate in American Studies at the University of Minnesota. If you're wondering if you're sensing a theme here, you are. Her dissertation project is about how the US used Japanese American incarceration during World War II to further Native dispossession. She is also a program associate at the University of Minnesota's Immigration History Research Center. And so thanks to both of you for being here with me today. Like I said, I'm so excited that you're here. And so our conversation today is about historical erasure. And so I'd like us to just kind of start there. You know, what is historical erasure? What are some examples of historical erasure that can help our audience think about these ideas?
So I guess I'll start with it. Historical erasure is something that can be deliberate or indeliberate in terms of thinking about narratives about history. And I think today we'll talk especially about US history and the exclusions that we can see in thinking about how history has been narrated as national history in this country. From my perspective, of course, I'm interested in Indigenous studies and Indigenous history, and our history has been left out for a very long time of national narratives, and including, if you look at the textbooks today, even for college students, there's very little presence of Indian history in those textbooks. And so what's happening is that our students are not being taught about the broader history of inclusion that would include Indigenous voices, Indigenous stories, as well as many other stories that have been omitted. I'll just start there.
Yeah, I think that's great. I think when we talk about historical erasure, we're often talking about power and how the power to tell the story or to create the story helps define how we get resources in the present too. Mm-hmm. And so historical erasure is something that impacts communities today. And it is not just about history. It is about the present. Absolutely. I also think it's not a either or. It's not like you either have power or you don't have power. Mm-hmm. It's about the differences in how power operates in different spaces. Mm-hmm. And so I think we need to all be very conscious about our own places in historical erasure and how our power can operate differently in different spaces. And I guess that's where I'll start.
You know, I would just add too, when you think about which stories get included, a lot of times you get a conversation in terms of textbooks, for example. What are you going to omit if you add other stories in? So that is a part of that power dynamic. That's a part of deliberately deciding what gets included and what doesn't get included. And sometimes it's a little bit like amnesia almost. A lot of my work has been on New England, the Northeast, and This book that Katie mentioned earlier that I've just written with Lisa Blee is about a monument. Actually, it's inspired by a monument to a Wampanoag leader by the name of Massasoit. And you probably don't know Massasoit's name, if you know, as an audience, but you know all about him in interesting ways, because Massasoit is the individual that gets associated with, first of all, making the first treaty of peace with the English in 1621 when the Pilgrims arrived. This is the 400th anniversary of the arrival of the English in Plymouth, which is being commemorated in interesting ways. But he also is iconic as the person who is figured in history as the person who really was about the first Thanksgiving. And so every American has something to do with that narrative every year. We'll see what that looks like this year with COVID, but there's a monument to him in Plymouth, Massachusetts that was erected in 1921. And one of the things we argue in that book is that that is all about historical erasure. That is a monument that, if you look at the plaque that was installed alongside it in 1921, tells us that he was the friend and protector of the Pilgrims. Well, the story, as you might imagine, is far more complicated than that, as it always is. But that's the message that the people who erected that monument wanted to convey, which erases this larger history of Indigenous presence in New England, as well as a history of conflict with the English. So monuments, we're talking a lot about monuments right now. Monuments are physical objects that both commemorate, but also very often erase much more complex histories.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think sorry, I completely lost my train of thought. Can we carry on?
Sure.
Well, and I think what's really fascinating about what you've both been saying so far is, you know, when we think about these ideas of historical erasure, like you're both saying, it's not solely limited to academia. It's not just limited to what we see in textbooks, right? I mean, if you think about it, it literally permeates every single avenue, right? If you think about the people that, you know, stop and look at that monument to Massasoit, it's the people who might drive by Fort Snelling on their way to work, right? I mean, we see it if you go to, you know, the Capitol grounds, and it's everywhere. And the fact that it's so omnipresent, but at the same time, we're so distanced from it, I think is one of the most powerful components of it, and also why it's so critical that we're talking about this.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think what I wanted to say is that it's not just about erasure, it's about replacing. And I think that's what Jeannie is kind of pointing at. That's so important, is that, you know, a lot of the time it doesn't look like blank space or something like that erasure. It looks like something else just taking the place of something that is actually really important and that does need to be talked about.
Exactly. And, you know, that there are so many more voices in the conversation these days. I mean, we've had a couple of years of really intense debates about commemoration, about monuments, about history, and people are passionate about their feelings about statues and what they think they stand for, and thus you see real conflict around this. And when Lisa and I were finishing this book, we were just getting ready to send it off to the University of North Carolina Press, and then Charlottesville happened. And we literally had to just stop and catch our breath and think about how we wanted to engage with all of the conversations and arguments that were happening about monuments, about commemoration, about history, without having it take over our book. Because these are all part of the same conversation. And so it's the statues, you know, they're bronze and stone or whatever they are, and they seem fixed, but they're not fixed. They're not fixed. The narratives around them are constantly changing and can be the subject really of healthy debate about the meaning of a national history, for example, and what is erased, what is omitted.
Yeah, and you know, we had in our earlier conversation, we talked, you know, some of the examples you both brought up. You talked about Plymouth Plantation, right, Jeannie? And then, you know, Hannah, you talked about how your work intersects with Fort Snelling and things like that. So maybe we can just kind of take a minute to, you know, we've done kind of the broad overview of historical erasure. And so if we can, you know, just kind of take some time, let's talk about some of these, you know, really concrete examples.
Why don't you start, Hannah?
Okay. Yeah, I think Fort Snelling is a really interesting example. And it's a personal one for me because I am Japanese American, but also, and white, and I'm also non-native. And I think, and my great uncle actually served at Fort Snelling during World War II when it was the host of the Military Intelligence Service. And he had been taken from the camps. And so basically was brought for his Japanese language skills that he had been highly discouraged from participating in to translate for the US government. And so on the one hand, that is a personal history for me. And on the other hand, I think Fort Snelling has so many complex histories there. And it's a sacred site for Dakota people. I think that is the foundational history that I kind of understand, that I feel like often gets erased in the conversations about the actual fort. And it's also a site of tremendous trauma for Dakota people and of a concentration camp there. And I think that power in historical erasure it sometimes looks like me as a Japanese American saying that we have a certain power in a space that is not, that isn't, we have a certain power in a space to both assert our own histories, and we also have a lack of power. You know, our histories get erased in really, really important ways, and I want to acknowledge that. But also, our histories are also being used every day to erase other histories. And I think we see that a lot in the movement for reparations. So in the 1970s, 1980s, Japanese Americans were advocating for reparations for what happened to them in the 1940s. And in 1988, they were successful. They received reparations for each of the surviving incarcerees. But the way that it was structured was really important because the federal government was very insistent that it had to be for people who were survivors, because they did not want that to be an option for American Indians or Black people who were descendants of immense wrongs. And so in that way, Japanese American reparations both made amends for one wrong and also erased another one, and made it that much harder, I think, to also seek out reparations for other groups. Yeah. Okay, Jeannie, pass it to you.
Well, these things are so complicated, right? I mean, and there is pushback of all sorts. And I'll go back to my example of the Massasoit Monument and talk about pushback. So at the 350th anniversary of the arrival of the Pilgrims, there's a big celebration. Of course, there's one planned for this year as well, which is now a little bit on hold because of COVID. But one of the things that the organizers did, based at Plymouth Plantation, which is where they emanate these celebrations from, is they invited an Indigenous person to come, and they had a speech written for him that they wanted him to deliver at this Thanksgiving banquet that they had at Plymouth Plantation. And instead, website of Frank James wrote one of his own, and they wanted to see it before he gave it. So they read it, and they deemed it insufficiently celebratory, shall we say. But he refused to read their speech. And instead what he did was he marched over to the Massasoit Monument, and he read that speech to fewer than a dozen people. This is the origins of what we know now is the National Day of Mourning that happens at Plymouth since 1970, every single year at Thanksgiving. It's an anti-Thanksgiving celebration, really. And a few years later, there was a semi-riot about the actual protests. And as a result of settling their differences, they agreed to erect another marker at the monument. And they gave this group, the United American Indians of New England, full ownership over what that text was going to say. And here we have a completely Indigenous version of what had happened on this spot. that is about genocide and colonization and the wrongs that were suffered by the Wampanoag people who are still here, although very much erased in the contemporary New England society. So we have this marker. And one of the things Lisa and I did was we interviewed people at the site of that statue and asked them what they thought this was all about. And those who took time to read that additional marker, really, they had much more complicated ideas about what was going on there. So the counter signage, which is something that you see in other places as well, is a way of erupting that erasure and saying, look, there's a more complicated thing that happened here, and let's have a conversation about it. So I like to see that there's possibilities of pushback, even in something that seems so fixed like this. At least there was we see that there is in the case of this one statue.
Yeah, and it's, Hannah, every time I hear about your research and the work you're doing, I just learn more and more things that I never knew. And, Jeannie, the same goes with your research. And I think that's one of the things that's so powerful about these conversations that we're having is, I think I've said this in some of the other sessions, but it's like, you don't know what you don't know. And so what does it mean, right? When we're talking about these ideas of the power of a space and the power of a place, and what it means for the people in New England to see the original text, and then to see this text from hundreds of years later, and it's just really telling. And Hannah, you were also talking a lot about language, right? And these ideas of how language has changed over time. And I think one thing as scholars who work in the realms that we do, as we continue to put our scholarship out there, one of the things we always tend to see is, you're revising history, you're erasing history. So what do you think of that conversation?
I think history has been revised ever since it was created. Everything is an interpretation, and I think we need to critically think about everything that is being put in front of us. And if anyone is telling you that history is any different than that, then they're basically just trying to create propaganda.
History is changing out all the time, as you point out. I mean, part of the reason for that is because what does history do? It's about asking questions in the present about how to understand how we got where we are today. And those questions are always changing. And so, of course, historical interpretations and perspectives are going to change over time. And there's been pushback at the inclusion that we've been seeing since, especially the 1970s, as the voices that are included in narratives of history have expanded, and it's become much more inclusive. But that's how we understand ourselves as a society, is to think back. How did we get to where we are now? How can we explain where we are as a nation, as people with different perspectives on what society is doing, where we are as a nation.
Yeah. And kind of going back to the theme of language, I think one thing that I've seen happen even over the course of my lifetime is the language around Japanese American incarceration changing. And I think, I grew up, when I was growing up, it was entirely called internment. And I think that's what most people would know it as today. But when I started learning more about it, I realized that, and I learned from some really important former incarcerees, actually, who told me that they hated that term because it actually refers to a legal process of imprisoning enemy aliens. And these individuals that I was speaking to were like, we were born in the United States. We weren't enemy aliens. Our parents weren't allowed to become citizens, but they had made their entire lives here. And I think just understanding how one word, even one word that we don't necessarily think all that hard about, can really shape the way we understand history. And I think that narrative, even though most people might not understand that very technical definition of internment, they understand that there is still this very pervasive narrative that Asian Americans more widely don't actually belong in this country. And I think that to me is what internment signifies, that, you know, that we are somehow enemy aliens. And now that we're talking about it in terms of incarceration, I think we can have a more nuanced conversation about what that language means. Mm-hmm. But I still hear people talking about it, not even using the term internment, which is an invented term. It was not being used during World War II. The term concentration camps was being used during World War II. The term evacuation, which is a giant euphemism because you evacuate people for to save them from something. They were not being saved. They were being forcibly removed from their homes. So I think language holds so much power, and the language that we use, we tend to think about it as being kind of innocuous and almost unimportant, but really it's the foundation for how we know things, you know, and how we know history and how we know our place in the world today.
Well, and Hannah, I'm so struck by, you know, the reality of what happened to Japanese Americans as a forced removal, because, mm-hmm. you know, for Jeannie and me as scholars who focus more on Native history, like those words are so ingrained in the work that we do, right? You have words like not only forced removal, but like you said, concentration camp mm-hmm. and genocide and things like that. And the power of language and what it does, but also what it conceals is also really important, because you talked about reparations. Mm-hmm. And in our earlier conversation, we brought up the idea of, you know, reconciliation. And, you know, I don't remember which one of you said it, but I'm going to steal your line. But, you know, what does it mean to apologize for overthrowing the Hawaiian kingdom? Mm-hmm. Right. And I think, Jeannie, you were the one who mentioned TRCs, right? Truth and Reconciliation. And, you know, what do they produce? Do they have any tangible results?
Right. Right. I mean, the idea of reconciliation is that, I mean, this is, Canada's been talking about this for a very long time. And the Truth and Reconciliation Commission there has had lots of really, really tangible outcomes, but also a lot of criticism. I mean, what does it mean? Does it mean, oh, we've now reconciled this, it's all over, it's all done? Does that mean we don't have to worry about the problem of murdered, missing Indigenous women and girls? Dispossession, ongoing disparities of all sorts, and racism and everything that goes along with that. You know, what does it all mean at the end of the day is a question. And does it mean we're supposed to now just get over it? This is a problem for Indigenous people, I think, globally, and not just Indigenous people. Of course, there are other TRCs all over the world that have happened, and, you know, what does it add up to is a question.
I thank you, Jeannie. Yes, and I hate that language of having to get over it so much, because it's always put on Black, Indigenous, and people of color to like get over our histories, mm-hmm. and our histories are how we understand ourselves. I don't think that anyone is going to get over their history. And I also don't think that we ask a lot of people to get over their histories. Right. You know, like no one goes around telling people to get over the 4th of July, right? Like I mean, maybe they should get over it, but like there's so much power in being able to tell someone to get over something. Mm-hmm. And I think when we think about these truth and reconciliation things, anything that is trying to tell people to get over their history, to move past something, is not actually seeking truth, because truth is ongoing. Mm-hmm. You know, it's something that people will continue to grapple with in new ways. Mm-hmm. And yeah, I thank you so much for that. Yeah.
You know, I always try to be hopeful, I guess. I find hope in my students all the time. I mean, I have a great group of students who are learning remotely this semester in Indian history. And, you know, they're like, I didn't know any of this. And I'm like, it's not your fault. here you are in this class, and you're going to learn this history, and congratulations and good for you, and thank you for taking the class. But also, I mean, I'll go back to Plymouth just because this, you know, I've spent a lot of time thinking about memory, erasure, and all this history there. So there was the 350th anniversary of the landing of the Pilgrims, and you know, now we're at 400. And actually, some interesting things have happened in connection with that, which partly is that the commission that they established, that they literally incorporated to plan events for this whole year, they actually included Indigenous people in that process pretty early on, and the result has been this really wonderful project by Paula Peters, who's a filmmaker and a lot of other things, and an activist. And she and other Indigenous public intellectuals in New England and all kinds of people have created this traveling exhibit and video series called Our History, 400 Years of Wampanoag History. And it's featured prominently on the website for the whole organization, and it's traveling New England. And people are paying attention to this story, which tells a different version of what happened 400 and more years ago. And so that, you know, that's a far cry from what happened in 1970 when Wamsutta Frank James was supposed to read a canned speech and refused. So, I mean, that's an example. This is a different historical moment, a moment where it's more inclusive. They could probably have done a lot more than they did do, but they didn't do nothing, and they did pay attention to Indigenous people.
Yeah. Yeah, and I think that, you know, you're pointing to your students is so important because it is an ongoing process, and we're all learning. You know, like I 5 years ago knew nothing about American Indian history. It was bad, honestly. In DC, growing up in DC, you don't ever have to learn about this stuff, and that's not something that my education demanded for me, and that I didn't know how to demand for myself. And I think that, like, learning how to demand the questions that people are not willing to answer for you, and that they are not seeking out, they're trying purposefully and maybe unconsciously sometimes to, like, avoid talking about. Those are the questions that we need to be asking for the answers for, and we need to be demanding the answers to. Mm-hmm. I think, you know, it's also that idea of inclusion is so important. And I think Katie's research actually speaks really well to this. So I'd actually really love to hear from Katie about this. But, like, that idea of, like, performance and of working people into a space only to then turn that into another form of historical erasure, right? Of kind of rewriting history in a way that seems like it's inclusive and seems like it's good, but actually really just reinforces some dominant narratives. So, Katie.
This is the downside of working with people who have known me for a long time. But I mean, I think that's, Hannah and Jeannie, you're both making such really great points. And, you know, with the productions that I researched for my book, that's fingers crossed coming out in the spring. I mean, that's historical erasure is so deeply tied to it, right? Because, you know, if you're going to create a production for tourists, right? Like, and you're using Native history as the basis for it, you have to be very particular and very careful about not only the stories you pick, but also the ways you tell those stories, because, you know, it's that idea of, you know, how much are you going to lean into that discomfort, right? Because if you're going to see an outdoor drama or a historical pageant about Indigenous history, right? Like, it's not going to be the story that you want to see, right? There has to be a very particular way in which the story is told, which in turn, like Hannah said, is creating even more historical erasure. Mm-hmm. And you know, Jeannie, with what you're saying about your students, I mean, my students are the same way. And it's just so intriguing to have a classroom of college students who are almost indignant.
Yeah.
When they're like, how did I not know this? Yeah. How did I not learn this before? And again, like you said, it's not their fault.
No.
And Hannah, like you, I didn't grow up knowing any of this stuff.
Yeah.
right? And there are just so many different layers to it and so many levels of history and stories that need to be told. And it's just, on one hand, it's a little bit daunting, but at the same time, it's just really invigorating to see all of this new scholarship and these new ways of teaching history and learning history. And I think that's just really fabulous.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
So one of the lines that stuck with me from the last panel was the director of the Anacostia Museum, and she was talking about how like there's this impression that museums are where old racist statues go to die. And I was just like they're, oh my gosh, because I used to work in museums, right? And that's exactly what we don't want museums to be. She was absolutely right about that. No one wants your museum. No one wants to go to that place, first of all. Like, why would anyone go to a museum if that's what it's doing? Although apparently people did for a little while there. So whatever. But yeah, like people want our histories to be relevant, right? We want them to be interesting. They should be interesting. This should be exciting for all of us because what we're talking about is making history relevant to the present. And instead of looking at it as a place where tired old racist statues go to hang out in some collection somewhere.
Yeah, I used to, for years and years when I'm teaching Indian history, I'd say, well, now this is something you might have learned in a history class at some point, but most of it's not. And at a certain point, I thought to myself, well, what are they learning in U.S. history? Because I just teach Indian history. So I went and I looked at one of the most prominent college textbooks, and I did a deep dive. And I literally looked for every passage on Indians that was included in this college textbook by famous historians. And once, you know exactly what I'm going to say. After 1890, guess how many total paragraphs I could put together? 7. We get 7 paragraphs in post 1890. How can you explain Indigenous sovereignty in the here and now with 7 paragraphs in a college textbooks on U.S. history? It's, this doesn't come from nowhere, and these are choices. That is an erasure of our history, and it's one that's potentially very damaging to us as tribal citizens in the 21st century, trying to exercise our sovereignty. That can't be understood if you don't know the history.
Mm-hmm.
Well, and I think, Jeannie, you're pointing to the deep dive of the textbook, and, one of the volumes you contributed to is called Why You Can't Teach United States History Without American Indians. Mm-hmm. And it's just always been so striking to see the work that you and all of these other scholars did with how few mentions of American Indian history related to anything. And Jeannie, I remember yours was on the gold rush.
Yeah.
And we never think about Indians when we think about the gold rush, which is this hugely pivotal moment in American history. And it's just, Indians aren't even a question in the lead up to the gold rush and also the after effects of it.
Right.
And just the sheer devastation that it caused.
Yeah.
And, and from there, this is going to take us nicely into what might end up being our last conversation point, because we're getting a lot of questions coming through on the chat, and I want to make sure that we have time to get to some of those. But if we kind of think about, okay, what are some of the tangible things we can do? Right? We're thinking about education, if we're thinking about public scholarship and things like that. Hannah, I'm going to kind of call you out here because I want you to talk a little bit about the new podcast you're working on with your brother. Just as, a lot of the questions we tend to get in these sessions are, okay, what can we do next? Right. And so I think your podcast is just a really fantastic example of taking all of this information and creating something that will hopefully have a pretty broad reach.
Yeah, thanks, Katie. It's a project that I'm super passionate about. I also think it's what we can do is demand answers, right? And I hope that the podcast will be part of that. And it's one venue in which we can demand answers. But the idea behind it is that a lot of times for Japanese American history and for a lot of histories by marginalized people, our histories get told by a lot of white scholars who have no connection to this history. And, both my brother and I have been frustrated with that our whole lives, I think. And so we decided that we wanted to make a podcast that was about the voices of the people who are incarcerated. And there's this amazing oral history project. It's called Densho. And they have been collecting oral histories, and they have probably about 1,000 in their collection right now. And so what we did was we just went through all of those oral histories. We have been using a search algorithm that my friend helped me build. I took a major dive into data science this summer to actually help me search through all of this content, because there's pages upon pages of it. And so now we search for these keywords, and it's amazing to kind of like bring together different people's voices. And in doing that, I think that what we're trying to say is like the history keepers aren't necessarily historians. Mm-hmm. I mean, obviously we are, but
we're an exception, right?
But also, my grandmother is a history keeper, right? Our grandparents, our great-grandparents, those are the people that we should be speaking to, and those are the people we should be listening to. And those are the people that often history has kind of told our histories without actually asking. Mm-hmm. So, that's what the podcast is all about. And it's called Kampu. Please listen to it.
Super exciting. That's a really fantastic thing to do. I think you're right. I mean, there are historians everywhere. I mentioned Paula Peters, the filmmaker, earlier. I mean, she starts our history with not with 1620, but with the kidnapping in 1614 of 27 men and boys by Englishman Thomas Hunt, Captain Thomas Hunt. And let's push this history back. This is a history she researched, and she got all these Indigenous actors to act out what that must have been like. And it's super powerful. So she made these videos as part of this exhibit. She's a history maker. She's a history keeper. And they're all over the place. They're not just in the PhD training and all of that. So there's lots of tangible things that can be done. I mean, the book that Katie mentioned earlier, Why You Can't Teach U.S. History Without American Indians. I mean, we're not the first people who thought, how do you get at this problem at all? I mean, there was a huge wave of conversation in the 1980s, in particular, out of the 70s research that happened. How can we transform the U.S. history narrative? That still hasn't happened, by the way. So the answer to some of us, my co-editors of that book, is we had a conference. And that was the call. How can you teach this history without American Indians? And so that book is partly to try to answer that question the other way around by saying, here's a book that's composed of lots of really fascinating chapters that teachers can read. Maybe incorporate some of this in the next time you teach, instead of like demanding that the whole narrative be changed. Give people the tools to tweak it around the edges as much as they can. So, I mean, there's lots of things people can do. There's great films that are getting made out there. Podcasts. I have my students listening to a lot of really great podcasts this semester as part of their remote learning. Podcasts are great, Hannah. I'm glad you're doing that. So there's lots of ways, I think, of getting at this that hopefully will make a difference. You mentioned Plymouth Plantation earlier, and I don't think I ever answered that question. I mean, one of the things that they did in response to the 1970s protests was to create what's called the Wampanoag Indigenous program at Plymouth Plantation, which they've renamed now to call it Plymouth Pawtuxet. So they're refiguring their identity right now as well. And in that program, Indigenous people have their own village site where they teach visitors to that place about Indigenous people, and they do so in the present tense, which is a really important radical move at a place where everything else is supposed to be about historical reenactment. That's to say, we are still here, and don't you forget it.
Well, and I think we've kind of been talking about this, but I think it's really important that people see how accessible history actually can be.
Mm-hmm.
And, for the three of us as scholars, right? Well, yes, a lot of times our work is intended for kind of the broader academic population, but at the same time, so many of these different pieces and the way we make it accessible, right? Like through Hannah's podcast and Jeannie, with what you're saying about Plymouth Patuxet, and really making sure that people who aren't necessarily academics per se can also have a really important piece, right? And, I love what you said, Hannah, about, history keepers,
Mm-hmm.
right? And I think that's like, I had goosebumps the first time you said it. And so we're at about time for our questions now. And, for those of you who are watching and listening, we will do our best to get through a couple questions here. We can't promise that we can get to everything. And so for Jeannie and Hannah, what's going to happen, they'll pop a question up for us. I'll just read it. So that way, if people are listening and, are not watching, then they can still get a sense of what's going on. And then I'll just kind of have you take a go at it. So Joseph Crow said, I see my awareness and understanding of any given historical event or period as an ever-expanding sphere of knowledge and learning about new aspects of that event or period. Can you provide an example of when we've effectively recognized our past understanding of history and included that with our new awareness?
Well, I would just like to say yes. We're always refining our understanding of history, historical events, historical periods, people, and you name it. I mean, that's why we historians have so many books, and why we keep needing to buy more and read them and try to figure out how it all fits together. I mean, I guess I would go to the example that I've been talking about. I mean, I really do think that 1970s protest was consequential. It had an impact on how it is that New Englanders, at least some of them, want to think about the past as a more complicated one than just the Pilgrims arriving for religious freedom, which is the story that gets told all over Plymouth still to this day. But it is a more complicated narrative that you can access there in lots of different ways that I haven't mentioned. But it's also really complicated. I want to just mention, some people may remember the installation of the scaffold in the Walker Art, the sculpture garden a few years ago, and the controversy about that, and that it ultimately was taken down over the protests of Dakota people, and the intellectual property rights were turned over to them as a nation by the artist Sam. I can't think of his name right now, his last name. Anyway,
Durant, I think.
Durant, thank you. Yes. So it turns out, in talking about this, Sam Durant he was from Plymouth. And he had been at those day of mourning protests. And somehow, in spite of that, he wasn't able to internalize Indigenous critiques about the ways that history gets presented. But it hit him like a ton of bricks at a certain point. So it's messy, it's complicated, and it takes Hannah used the word earlier, grappled. It takes grappling with a complicated past where there are lots of different perspectives to be had. So I think this is just an ever-changing landscape, hopefully.
I agree with that. And I think it's often leaning into our own discomfort sometimes. And it's something, I mean, no one wants to do that, right? Discomfort is there for a reason. It's usually something that we push away from. Yeah. But I try to tell my students that when you are uncomfortable, that's the moment when we are closest to learning something new. And it's important to recognize when discomfort is something that is trying to protect us and when it's trying to stop us from questioning our worldviews. And so I think when we really can lean into that discomfort and say, this is where that discomfort is coming from, this is why it's there, and this is what it's trying to shield me from, then we start to get towards those answers that do change our worldview and that do help us grapple with things that we have been trying to avoid talking about.
Yeah, and again, with both of the things you're talking about, with with Plymouth, and then, you know, Hannah, this idea, right, where it's like, what do you do when you hit that moment of discomfort, right? Like, do you kind of stop and say, okay, let's lean into it? Or is that the moment when when people kind of shut down? And I think that's what's really important in this historical moment that we're in right now, right? Where it's like that discomfort can be such an incredible learning experience.
Mm-hmm.
And so if we can pull up another question. So Carrie Peterson said, Hannah, your PhD discusses the Japanese internment and erasure. I hope I'm stating that correctly. And you mentioned the reparations would make it harder for Black descendants of slaves or Indigenous peoples to get reparations, and that Fort Snelling was an internment camp. And then they said, I didn't know that. And so could you discuss in a little more depth how Japanese internment erased Indigenous peoples?
Yeah, absolutely. I think that Japanese American incarceration has often been used to, and this isn't something that we tend to think about, but what we do think about is Japanese American incarcerated labor being used for farming. Mm-hmm. Okay. And I think that the idea of farming is so fundamental to how we think about our identity in the US, right? And if we think about settling, right, that is also, farming is also a very key part of that. And so what the incarceration did is it removed Japanese Americans from the West Coast, often taking any homes, land that they had acquired and finding ways to distribute that among white settlers. And it pushed them onto sites that were throughout the country that had often been deemed kind of unusable for some reason. So one of the sites that I'm thinking about is Heart Mountain, which actually, and Heart Mountain is actually how I came to my project, because it is the site where my grandmother was incarcerated during World War II. And the thing that I had never realized until I started working for Heart Mountain a while ago is that the Apsalake, or Crow, had been forced from Heart Mountain about 70 years before Japanese Americans were forced to that same site. And the irony of that one group of people would be forced from that land only to have another group of people forced to that land was something that, like, it created a question for me, and I wanted to know the answer to that question. And so eventually what I started to realize is that it was part of this process, you know, of removing American Indians from their lands and then using racialized incarcerated labor to turn that land into sites that could become homesteads for often white veteran settlers. And I think that's also an example of historical erasure, right? That, like, we can take this land, we can have Indigenous history here. And then now the site is often, there is a Japanese American museum there that is doing really fantastic work. But also that the Crow history there isn't often talked about, and it has to be, I think, kind of, it does not have its own space there. And I think that is also important. I also think, you know, the first time I went to Heart Mountain was with my grandmother, and I was probably about 12 years old. And there was this horrifying monument there. It said something, it was talking about how great the education system was. It said the hospitals were state of the art. It was talking about how wonderful everything was. You would have thought that these places were like the place to go. But underneath it, someone had scrawled in spray paint, it was a concentration camp. And that was the line that really stuck with me. You know, that sometimes monuments, the part that's written in stone isn't the part that's actually true. It's the part that's graffitied underneath it that's actually, like, really holding on to that truth for us. Sorry, that kind of deviated away from my initial thought, but again, that there was a monument to Japanese American incarceration, that it was so flawed, and also that there was nothing about Crow removal from that land.
Mm-hmm.
I think that's really important.
Well, and you've also mentioned that one of the internment camps for Japanese Americans wasn't one of them named after a commissioner of Indian Affairs?
Yeah, I think Loop and Poston possibly were. I think, yeah, Poston was named after Charles Poston. And yeah, so Loop it's interesting because it was not really one of the main camps. It was the place where like the troublemakers were sent, right? And it was also, but it was put on in an abandoned boarding school, a shut down boarding school, on the Navajo Nation. And it actually had a prison inside of the school, just to really show how horrific these sites were. There was a prison for young children in this school. No school should ever have a prison. And that actually, the fact that it had a prison is what helped it become a good site for Japanese American incarceration later on. And now a lot of the time, what people talk about at Loop is Japanese American incarceration on that site, and not the fact that it was being used as an American Indian boarding school for many, many years before that. And it was really only used, I think, for about like 9 months for Japanese American incarceration. It was terrible what was happening during those 9 months, absolutely. But it also has a much, much longer history.
Yeah, and I think that just, again, like these connections you're making between all of these different experiences, I think is also what makes, the willingness to understand this history really powerful. All right, so I think we have time for hopefully a couple more questions if we can get the next one. So Christine Jones asks, this is such a good question. What can teachers do when they are given the Texas textbook to teach from, since the scholarship of the last few decades is erased in those texts by their committee?
Oh my gosh, I wish I had a good answer for you. I think not everybody realizes that the textbook markets in Texas and California dictate what goes into textbooks because they're big markets and they control the content. And I guess the question, I'm wondering if the question is about probably secondary education or K-12. Probably, because there's the additional issue of teaching to the standards, right? So, I think that's a really, really hard question to answer. I would call it a very hard problem to solve when you combine those two things. That's where the textbooks really come from, by and large, and that there are these requirements that you teach to the standards so that your students can pass exams. That leaves, I think, very little wiggle room for teachers. And, I'm imagining it just takes creativity around the edges to figure out how you can teach a more complicated narrative. I guess if it were me and I were in that situation, I would probably teach against the textbook. That's something that we talk about in the academy quite a bit. How do you address the issue of erasures and mythology making and so forth? And you can say, well, here's a narrative. What do we think of it? How can we complicate it? How can we problematize it? So, and of course, you're mandated to teach particular texts by some school districts as well, right? So that's not a very satisfying answer, I'm afraid, but I think that's what I would have to say.
I think Jeannie is absolutely right. And also, kudos to all of the teachers out there who are having to do that, because that sounds like a really, really tough job, especially because I think then all of the labor falls on you to do that extra work to make sure your students are getting something beyond the textbook. I do know that there are some, at least I would imagine that there are other organizations that do this, but there are a lot of Japanese American organizations that create curricula for around Japanese American incarceration. And so I think what Jeannie is talking about, like teaching against the textbook, making your students really question what is in that textbook and pairing it probably very carefully with some outside resources that, I am so sorry, there is a siren going. But yeah, pairing it with outside resources that can help destabilize the textbook further is probably how I would go about doing that. And I think, Jean said she's teaching with podcasts this term. I obviously love the podcast that I am working on. There's tons of great films out there. You just have to kind of like start figuring out where they are.
I've discovered so many in trying to transform my Indian history course to remote. Found so many great short clips on the internet, and I'm using them, and I think they're really, really helpful. And especially in this teaching environment we're in, it's really kind of a good way to get at this. And maybe it's a good way to teach critical thinking, right?
Yeah.
So what can you imagine might be missing from this story? Might be a question you ask repeatedly.
Yeah, and again, just I think with what we're having to do, how creative we have to get now in terms of teaching, I think in some instances, yes, it is so much extra work, but I think the way that students are responding to these types of, to these new kinds of information and modes of delivery, I think is really helpful. And, hopefully that's something that we can keep experimenting with to see where we get. All right, so we have time for one, maybe two more questions. We'll have to see where we get. So Megan Evans said, popular culture often rewrites and erases history for entertainment purposes, and sadly it can spread a lot of information and stereotypes, like the misnaming of Pocahontas. Are there ways you feel that we as consumers can better demand historical and cultural integrity in a field that is for entertainment?
Oh, what great questions we're getting, and they're like mostly unanswerable, which is the very definition of a good question, I guess. I'm thinking about the movie Moana that came out a couple of years ago, and just how much consternation this cost my friends who are Pacific Islanders and Native Hawaiians in trying to think about what they should do about representations in that film. And that it's complicated because, of course, there was Indigenous involvement in the making of that film as well. I mean, I don't know. The America loves Disney, right? I mean, you go straight down the line. I mean, the number of students, I bet, Katie, you'll say this too, you get in your classroom who are crushed that Pocahontas that they grew up with isn't the story. But they love it. They know how to make films that sell. So, I mean, I guess we have to push back on it. We all teach popular culture, at least to some extent, I think, in our classrooms, but that's one small arena. I don't think the film industry listens to anything but money, so that's hard.
Yeah. I mean, it's hard to say, not spending $15 on a ticket is maybe going to make a little bit of a difference over time, I guess, especially if you can convince other people to not spend $15 on a ticket. I think also there's so many avenues for getting your voice out there too. Like, this does not need to be just historians saying that this is wrong anymore. There's Twitter, there's Facebook, there's Instagram. There are all of these platforms that are where you can help share your perspective on this and show that this isn't something that just a few like dusty historians care about.
Yeah.
We're not dusty. But, also, the general public wants really good representation.
Yeah.
This is something that people care about. And I think when Hollywood starts to understand that, then they will start doing better.
I will recommend a fantastic film called Real Indians, spelled R-E-E-L, Indians, by Neil Diamond, not the singer-songwriter, but the Canadian filmmaker. And it's a very close look at the history of Native people, Indigenous people, Indians in Hollywood. And it's fantastic. It's funny. It's wonderful. And it ends with contemporary Indigenous filmmaking. So there's a place to start if you want to have a look for yourself.
Isn't that is the other part of it though, too, is that, it's not just about making sure that bad movies don't get made. It's about promoting the ones that are out there doing that good work, and often doing it without much of a budget too.
Absolutely.
Well, that is the perfect note for us to end on. And so I want to thank Jeannie and Hannah. Thank you so much for being here. It was great to have you. I want to thank all of our audience members, whether you were listening in or whether you were able to watch. And just so everybody knows, the program will be archived. It'll be available again on Facebook and on YouTube. And I just want to invite everybody to join us for our fourth and final program in the series, which is scheduled for October 22nd at 3 p.m. Same time, same place. I'm going to be here as we as we discuss artistic responses to this moment. And I'll be joined by, among others, representatives from the Urban Art Mapping Project at St. Thomas, Setu Jones, who is a multidisciplinary artist, advocate, and maker based in St. Paul, and Erin Genia, who is Sisseton Wahpeton Oyate, and is a multidisciplinary artist, educator, and community organizer who specializes in Indigenous arts and culture. So once again, thank you all so much for being here. Miigwech to Jeannie and Hannah, and to everybody backstage at MNHS. Mm-hmm. And we hope to see you next month.
Miigwech, thanks for having us.
Thank you.